I had lived in my quiet suburban neighborhood for about a year before I had my first run-in with Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. From the moment I moved in, she had a problem with me. Whether it was my car being too old and ugly for the driveway, my grass being half an inch too high, or my mailbox not being the same shade of beige as the others, she constantly found reasons to issue me violations. At first, I thought she was just an overly strict HOA enforcer, but I quickly realized she had a personal vendetta against me. The final straw came when she tried to fine me $500 for allegedly painting my front door a shade of blue that wasn't on the approved color list. When I checked the list, the exact color was listed, proving she was just making up rules as she went along. I fought back and refused to pay, which only escalated the situation. Soon after, she began sending me legal threats, claiming that if I didn't comply with HOA regulations, I would be evicted from the neighborhood. The problem? I owned my house outright, and the HOA had no such authority. Karen, however, was relentless. She posted notices on my door, spread rumors among the neighbors that I was a troublemaker, and even reported me to the city for supposed code violations, all of which were dismissed. The tension between us grew so intense that I decided to dig into Karen's background. That's when I made a shocking discovery: she didn't actually own her house. Through a little research, I found out that her property had been sold in a quiet foreclosure sale years ago, and the current owner, who happened to be a silent investor, was actually me. Without realizing it, I had purchased Karen's house as part of a real estate investment portfolio. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. She was trying to evict me from the neighborhood, but in reality, I was her landlord. The moment I confirmed the paperwork, a plan formed in my mind, one that would turn the tables on Karen in the most satisfying way possible. But first, I had to play along and let her dig her own grave. After discovering that I was technically Karen's landlord, I knew I had to be strategic. If I revealed the truth too soon, she might find a way to weasel out of the situation. So, I decided to let her keep pushing, giving her enough rope to hang herself. Karen continued her crusade against me with increasing aggression. She sent me another letter from the HOA, this time claiming that my fence was too high and threatening a $1,000 fine. Of course, I checked the HOA regulations and found that my fence was well within legal limits. When I pointed this out to her, she scoffed, dismissing me like I was some tenant she could bully into submission. The sheer audacity of it all made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. Instead of arguing, I smiled and told her I'd look into it. That seemed to irritate her even more. Then, she took things to another level. One morning, I woke up to find my car towed from my own driveway. Furious, I called the tow company, who informed me that an HOA representative had reported my vehicle as abandoned. I knew exactly who was behind it. I had to pay nearly $300 to get my car back, but I didn't retaliate, yet. I let Karen believe she was winning. Over the next few weeks, she bombarded me with increasingly absurd violations, each accompanied by a hefty fine. I ignored them, knowing she had no legal power over my property. Then came the ultimate blow. She delivered a final warning, stating that if I didn't comply with HOA rules, the board would begin the process of removing me from the community. That's when I knew the time had come to strike back. I reviewed all the documents I had on Karen's property. According to the county records, her house had been foreclosed on years ago due to unpaid debts. The bank had sold it to an investment firm, which in turn had included it in a bulk real estate transaction. That's where I came in. I had purchased a series of properties through a blind trust, not even realizing Karen's house was among them. And here she was, acting like she owned the entire neighborhood, when in reality, she was just a tenant. Smirking, I checked her lease agreement and found that she was, in fact, behind on her rent. Legally, I had every right to evict her. It was poetic justice. She had spent months trying to kick me out of a home I owned, all while living in a home I technically controlled. The irony was too perfect. I had everything I needed to end this once and for all, but I wanted to make sure the lesson was one she'd never forget. So, I decided to hit her where it hurt most, her pride. The moment she threatened legal action against me, I knew it was time to reveal the truth. I drafted an official-looking letter, one that would change the course of our feud forever. But instead of delivering it immediately, I planned to wait until the HOA meeting, where Karen would be surrounded by the very people she ruled over with an iron fist. I wanted witnesses. I wanted her humiliation to be public. And most of all, I wanted her to realize, too late, that she had messed with the wrong person. The night of the HOA meeting, I arrived early and took a seat near the front, eager to watch Karen's downfall unfold in real time. The room buzzed with the chatter of neighbors, most of whom had been on the receiving end of Karen's ruthless HOA enforcement at some point. She walked in with her usual air of arrogance, smugly glancing around as if she owned the place. Dressed in her signature beige power suit, she clutched a stack of violation notices like they were legal decrees, ready to dish out her next round of punishments. What she didn't know was that this meeting would be one she'd never forget. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time launching into a tirade about neighborhood standards. She pointed to me, claiming that I was a repeat offender and had ignored numerous citations. With exaggerated exasperation, she announced that she had begun the process to have me removed from the neighborhood for failing to abide by HOA rules. The smugness in her voice was almost unbearable. I let her talk, enjoying every second of her self-incriminating speech. Then, when she finally finished, I stood up, holding a stack of papers. "Karen," I began, my voice calm but firm, "you've made it clear that you want me out of this neighborhood. But there's a problem with your plan, because I own my house outright. You have no legal authority to evict me." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "The HOA has authority over all properties in this neighborhood, and you have repeatedly violated our rules." I smirked. "Interesting. You seem very concerned about homeownership and neighborhood authority. Tell me, Karen, do you actually own your home?" The room went silent. Her face twitched slightly, but she kept up her composure. "Of course, I do." "That's a ridiculous question." I pulled out the lease agreement. "That's funny, because according to these county property records, your home was foreclosed on years ago and purchased by an investment firm. That firm later sold it to another investor, one who now legally owns your house." She paled. That's impossible." I stepped closer, handing her a copy of the documents. "You see, Karen, I did some digging. Your name isn't on the deed. You don't own your house, you rent it. And, fun fact, the person you're renting it from is me." The silence in the room was deafening. Karen's hands trembled as she skimmed the documents. I could see the moment the truth hit her, the sheer, gut-wrenching realization that she had spent months trying to evict the one person who had the legal power to evict her. A neighbor snickered, then another. Whispers filled the room. Karen, the tyrant of the HOA, had just been exposed as a mere tenant. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, but it is," I continued. "Not only do I own your house, but according to your lease agreement, you're also behind on rent." Her jaw dropped. I turned to the rest of the HOA board. "Now, I'd like to formally file a complaint. As a landlord, I believe it's inappropriate for a tenant, especially a delinquent one, to be making legal threats against homeowners. And given that she's been abusing her position, I think it's time we discuss her removal from the HOA board." The board members exchanged glances. They knew they had no choice but to entertain the motion. Karen's fate was no longer in her hands. She had built her reputation on authority and intimidation, but now she was powerless. And I wasn't done yet. "In fact," I added, my grin widening, "since she's already in violation of her lease, I think it's time I serve her an official notice to vacate. Effective immediately." Karen looked like she was about to faint. The mighty HOA queen was about to be dethroned by the very person she had tried to destroy. Karen's face twisted into a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sheer panic as the reality of her situation sank in. For years, she had ruled the HOA like a tyrant, issuing fines and threats without a second thought. But now, she was the one facing removal, not just from the HOA board, but from her own home. The room was deathly silent, all eyes fixed on her as she clutched the documents I had handed her. Her hands trembled as she skimmed the legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole. This can't be right," she stammered. "This is a mistake." I crossed my arms and shook my head. It's not a mistake, Karen. The house was foreclosed on years ago. You've been living in a home that you don't own, and you've been paying rent to me. And since you're behind on those payments, I have every legal right to evict you. The room erupted into murmurs as the other neighbors absorbed the shocking news. Some looked amused, others satisfied. Karen had tormented nearly everyone in this community at some point, and now she was finally getting what she deserved. But despite being exposed, she wasn't going to go down without a fight. You can't do this to me, she screeched, her voice losing its composure. I have rights. The HOA. I cut her off with a smirk. The HOA has no authority over property ownership, Karen. You should know that, considering how much you claim to be an expert on the rules. But since you want to talk about rights, let's talk about mine as your landlord. According to your lease agreement, you're required to pay rent on the 1st of every month. You haven't done that for 3 months. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up another document, a formal notice to vacate. Since you're in violation of your lease, I am officially giving you notice. You have 30 days to leave the property, or I will begin formal eviction proceedings. The room collectively gasped. Karen's face turned beet red, her lips opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She was completely speechless, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. But, of course, she wasn't going to take this lying down. You're bluffing, she finally spat, regaining a sliver of her usual arrogance. I have lawyers. I'll fight this in court. You won't get away with this. I shrugged. Go ahead. But the law is on my side, and every document I've shown you is 100% legitimate. You can waste your money on lawyers, but it won't change the fact that your lease is expired, your rent is overdue, and legally, you have no right to stay in that house. Karen's breathing became ragged, her fingers tightening around the documents. She glanced desperately at the HOA board, but they all avoided eye contact. No one was coming to her rescue. In fact, one of them, a man she had fined multiple times for parking violations, spoke up. Honestly, Karen, I think it's time for you to step down from the HOA board. It's inappropriate for a tenant to be making rules for homeowners. Another board member nodded. Agreed. You've been abusing your power for years, and now it's clear that you shouldn't have had it in the first place. Karen's face drained of all color. She was losing everything, her power, her reputation, her home. And she knew it. This isn't over, she hissed, glaring at me with pure hatred. I'll find a way to stay. I'll fight you with everything I have. I grinned. Good luck with that. But just so you know, I've already spoken with my lawyer. If you refuse to leave after 30 days, I'll file for a formal eviction. And with your unpaid rent, that will likely result in a court judgment against you. Meaning not only will you be homeless, you'll also have an eviction on your record. That'll make it pretty hard for you to rent anywhere else. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Karen's eyes. She had spent so long being in control, so long believing she was untouchable, that she had never considered what it would be like to be on the receiving end of the system she had used to torment others. She had no power here anymore. And she knew it. Her hands tightened into fists. Then, without another word, she stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. The silence in the room was quickly replaced by hushed laughter and murmured conversations. The HOA board members, relieved to finally be rid of her, immediately moved to vote on her removal. It was unanimous. Karen was officially ousted from her position. But as satisfying as that was, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't just accept her fate quietly. She would fight. She would scheme. She would try to find a way to stay. But I was ready for her. And no matter what she tried next, she was already finished. For the next few weeks, Karen did everything in her power to fight back. She ignored the notice to vacate, refused to acknowledge her unpaid rent, and even went door to door, trying to rally the neighbors to her side. It was almost sad, almost. She painted herself as a victim, claiming that I had tricked her, that I was some kind of con artist who had stolen her home. But the community wasn't buying it. After years of being harassed by her ridiculous HOA rules and excessive fines, most of the neighbors were more than happy to see her go. Some even started calling her homeless HOA Karen behind her back. But Karen wasn't done making a scene. A few days after the HOA meeting, she had the audacity to send me a cease and desist letter, a pathetic, amateur attempt at scaring me. She claimed that I had illegally obtained her home and that she was exploring legal action to reverse it. I didn't even bother responding. Instead, I handed the letter straight to my lawyer, who laughed before drafting the official eviction filing. Karen had backed herself into a corner, and now the law was closing in on her. Still, she refused to leave. With her 30-day notice period ticking down, she became more erratic. She stopped paying utilities, likely thinking she could sabotage the house before she was forced out. She trashed the yard, left garbage on the porch, and even encouraged her two equally insufferable little dogs to use the front lawn as their personal bathroom without cleaning up after them. None of it mattered, because I had already filed the formal eviction case. On the day of the court hearing, Karen showed up in her usual beige power suit, acting as if she still had control over the situation. She ranted about how I was a fraud and how the HOA had the final say in the neighborhood. The judge was not amused. He barely let her finish before cutting straight to the facts. Her house had been foreclosed years ago. I was the legal property owner. She had been renting and was behind on her payments. Legally, she had no right to stay. Karen's face twisted into a deep scowl as the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full eviction rights. She had exactly 7 days to vacate, or law enforcement would physically remove her. That's when the waterworks started. She begged the judge, claiming she had nowhere else to go. She even threw out the classic "I'm a single woman. Where will I live?" as if that somehow erased the months of harassment and fines she had thrown at me. The judge was unmoved. "That is not this court's concern," he said simply before banging his gavel. It was over. But Karen, true to form, still refused to go quietly. The eviction deadline came, and Karen still hadn't left. I had expected this, so I had already scheduled the sheriff's department to handle it. That morning, a group of officers arrived, along with a moving crew I had hired just to speed up the process. Karen was in full meltdown mode. She screamed at the officers, claiming I had tricked her out of her house and that she would be calling her lawyer. One of the deputies sighed and simply handed her the official court order. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "Pack a bag. The rest of your belongings will be moved out." And just like that, the HOA queen was dethroned. The neighbors gathered around, watching as Karen was forcibly escorted from the house. Some recorded the moment on their phones, others just smirked. As her furniture and boxes were loaded onto the curb, she stood there, powerless, humiliated, and homeless. For years, she had tormented everyone, thinking she was untouchable. But in the end, she had been evicted by the very same system she had used to threaten others. Karen disappeared after that, leaving behind only her reputation as the biggest HOA tyrant this neighborhood had ever seen. No one knew where she went, and frankly, no one cared. As for me, I rented out the house to a wonderful family, a kind couple with 2 kids who actually cared about the neighborhood. The HOA, now free from Karen's reign of terror, became a lot more reasonable. And the best part? At the next HOA meeting, they voted to abolish most of the ridiculous rules Karen had put in place. So in the end, not only did Karen lose her home, but she also lost every ounce of power she had fought so hard to hold onto. Justice had been served. And I never had to deal with HOA Karen ever again.